All right, there's some temperature data here. Calorimetry experiment with specific heat. So here's water for the point of calibration that was in freezing water. And so we can find the freezing point right there. And then we put it in, put a flame on under the water, and whoo, boy, it got hot. And then it boiled. We moved the temperature probe into a cup, a calorimetry cup, sitting about at room temperature. And then after a couple minutes, we took the steel nut that was in the boiling water and dropped it in the water, which raised the temperature up. And so there's the temperature change, and the specific heat is going to be calculated using the mass and the change in the temperature of both steel and the water. So this data was taken, and we have a 0 point that should be right down here. When I highlight this region, I find what the 0 point offset is, and it's about 0.35 is what I measured it. If we zoom in here, bada bing, we can see where it's sitting in the freezing water and figure out what that 0 point should be. We recorded those numbers here. It was at 0.34 is where it froze. And so the idea is that we want to try to justify this data by shifting all the data down 0.34. Now it's really kind of nice because the boiling point also happened 0.34 above where we expected. We expected it a little bit above because the barometric pressure and a calculation told us that, oh, it should be boiling at this point, and well, let's look at the numbers. Boiling should have been at 94.465, but indeed it boiled at 94.8. And that's a 0.34 degree shift, which is also the measuring shift in the 0 degrees Celsius, the freezing point. So the thermometer's linear, that's a good thing, and a 1 point calibration is sufficient, so I can shift all the data down by 0.43 degrees Celsius. To do that, we're going to go into the calculator up here at the top of the screen next to the stopwatch numbers. So click on calculate and say new. And let's call this temperature shift. And say equals the temperature minus 0.34. And hit accept, and it says, well, what do you mean by temperature? Well, we take temperature over here in the summary window and drag it to the temperature question for defining temperature. Or we could have done it this way, chosen this drop down next to that question of defining the temperature and found data measurement in the drop down list. The data measurement then shows us all possible sensors, and we choose temperature, and now it's there. It's also important to go into properties and name this measurement. For some reason it's just called Y, and so I'm going to call this, I don't know why it's called Y, instead of the name that I gave it. So let's say temperature, and let's call this temperature shift. And the units, Option Shift 8 will give me a degree symbol, and then capital C. And I'll leave the precision alone for now, although that's probably 1 decimal place too many for what we're doing. And accept. Now we'll notice over here there are data values calculated. So if I go into the graph, I can drop run number 4, temperature shift, onto the graph. And if you can see in there, it is red and blue because they're almost superimposed. But when we zoom in, we see that the blue data, which is the new temperature shift data, and I like to go in here into my legend and show the measurement name. That kind of helps out when you're looking up here to see which color is which. But we should have known because all this data has been shifted down to show that water was freezing at 0 degrees Celsius. And it was distilled water. And if we zoom out and then zoom in on this region, we'll see the boiling point. Bada bing. Okay, it was also shifted down, of course, because all the data was shifted. Now, ultimately, this shift in the data is not important for calorimetry because we're finding differences, changes in temperature. And if we're shifting all the data in one direction, the change doesn't really matter. If we're let me say that again. If we're shifting all the data the same way, the difference will be the same, with or without the shift. Because this distance, well, let's bring this in line here with this region, and then we'll bring this up here to show a change in water temperature. That change of 1.5 or 1.6 degrees Celsius is going to be the same even if we take all this data and shift it up by 0.34. 0.34 up here and 0.34 up here means, you know what? Enough said. So that's the calorimetry data.